I am serving as chair of this invited symposium, course called Moving Beyond Cognitive Universals, in collaboration with Angela Gutchis and Ayana Thomas. We've organized the symposium to focus on the important yet often ignored influence of race in the study of human cognition. Talks and discussion today will highlight that the search for species-typical cognitive universals that center cognition as a solely internal individual process has inadvertently constrained research and theory, and likely dissuaded some scholars from engaging in cognitive research. The panel of experts will present research that highlights why race should be considered in understanding human cognition, and how we as a field may eliminate structural barriers that have prevented this important discussion. The symposium was invited by the Psychonomic Society as part of their continued support for conversations and scholarship on the topic of race, and was organized in collaboration with the Spark Society. Before we begin, we would like to remind you all that following the symposium at 6 p.m. Central Time, there will be an informal discussion regarding issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we encourage you to join us there. Now I will turn it over to our first speaker.
Greetings. Thank you for coming by my talk. This is a quick presentation on thinking about how we might reconstruct how we study human cognition. Specifically in regards to how we think about the idea of cognitive universals and variation in cognition. So studying human cognition is difficult for a lot of different reasons. Behavioral scientists spend a lot of time and energy on creating clever measures and recruiting people for our studies. And it turns out that the people recruit can vary a lot. How do we as a field handle all that potential variation in what people are like? Collectively, it's fair to say that we don't very well. The cognitive literature is full of studies that report remarkably little about who the participants are. These studies may also rely on homogeneous participant samples, including but not limited to the local undergraduate population. And then we treat that set of people as representatives of default humans. So there are some overlapping issues here that a lot of other researchers have pointed out, and there are different ways of framing the problem. You could call it the weird problem. I think it's related to issues about replication and ultimately about how we construct theories of cognition. The solution to these interconnected problems is to reconstruct how we study human cognition. Collectively as a field, we need to do better at embracing the interaction of cognition and participant contexts. That is the proper level of analysis for us as a field. Focusing on this will mean needing to spend just as much time and effort in characterizing the developmental, cultural, and societal contexts as we do for characterizing the internal cognitive mechanisms of behavior. So for the framework, I suggest 4 different things. Center cognitive research on following priorities. 1 is focus on participants' contexts. The 2nd is to embrace complexity in design and analysis of the studies. 3rd is to employ quantitative intersectional frameworks. And 4 is to explicitly consider constraints on generality. In examining participants' contexts, what I mean by context is really any and everything. Some examples include demographic variables like gender, race, or socioeconomic status. Keep in mind that these are shortcuts to thinking about differences in experience. What about other things like stress or characteristics of the physical environment? These are all potential aspects of context that you might want to pay attention to. I don't want to be overly prescriptive here in terms of which aspects of context the researcher may be looking at. What may be interesting and useful for each study may vary. Not everyone's going to be able to cover the same thing, and no one's going to be able to cover everything at once. Fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are other fields that have spent years thinking about this, sometimes at different levels of analysis. Think about sociology, education, and public health, particularly in public health, looking at things like social determinants of health. A broad interdisciplinary knowledge and perspective is going to be crucial for us as cognitive researchers. This isn't just about paying more attention to who your participants are. It's about attending to the differences in experience and context that we all know are there, but we might not know exactly what to do with. Second is to embrace complexity in study design and analysis. Elegance seems great for a single study, but it may be a little overrated for the field at large. Think about how you imagine a physics experiment, something that's kind of well controlled versus astronomy, without tight experiments, but with a lot of work on observation and analysis. Where we are as a field, or where we ought to be as a field, may be a little closer to astronomy than we think. If you're familiar with other areas of social sciences where controlled experiments aren't really possible, this sort of approach is common. Related to both context and complexity, I also think it's important to think about intersectionality. So intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to influence their experiences, particularly with regards to discrimination and privilege. Since we're interested in differences in experience in developmental, cultural, and societal contexts, this is highly relevant to us. Intersectionality as a framework has been more associated with qualitative approaches. While there may be some benefits to adding qualitative methods, many of us are probably going to continue to use quantitative approaches. Fortunately, there has been some work in understanding how quantitative approaches can lend themselves to this sort of framework. And those are the citations here at the bottom that I highly recommend. The fourth is to explicitly consider constraints on generality. We already do this to some degree. That's why we have limitation sections at the end of many of our papers. But more kind of explicit grappling with how well the results may generalize, particularly in regards to who the participants are in that particular study. It isn't about one sample being right. It's more about theorizing what experiences in one context may matter for the behavior observed in that particular study. There may be many benefits for taking the sort of approach that I've outlined here. Connections to other disciplines are very important. Cognitive researchers oftentimes try to make connections to areas such as education and neuroscience. I think it's important to continue to do that. I think the results are more likely to be accurate and useful in the long term. We're going to continue to build as cognitive work as a cumulative science. We're going to need to take that kind of long-term approach and a long-term view. Work that is better able to generalize or more accurately able to describe when it generalizes and when it doesn't will be more likely to be useful outside of the field and outside of just kind of arguments back and forth within the field. It would certainly be a simpler story if we could ignore these variables or feel like we've kind of controlled for them. It's not necessarily going to be the correct story. No individual study is going to be perfect. I'm not arguing that there's going to be a set aspect of context for each study that the focus of the study may depend on which aspects of context the researchers want to look at. So keep that in mind. And lastly, as for what is and what is not cognition, or what aspects of data we may feel are relevant to cognition, that has changed over the years quite a bit. It's not a natural category, it's something that we decide as researchers. And so bringing in a little bit more information about the external context or the experiences of the people in our studies is certainly something we can do while still keeping cognition kind of well-defined as we like to study it. So the relevance of this framework to the state of the discipline, broadly speaking, the ongoing issue of the field in how we think about human cognition, you can see in other different fields, there's been a lot of work thinking about the past, present, and future. You see this in anthropology, in genetics. I think for us in cognition, there are a lot of possible futures for us. And there's one where we actively address these issues and hopefully get to understand more and more about human cognition and the wide array of variation there is in how people behave. Thank you for coming.
Welcome. The title of my talk today is Beyond White Monolingual Hegemony in Cognition, Interrogating Our Complicity. But before I get started, I want to acknowledge my positionality and how I arrived at this work and how I actually approach my work. So I am a Mexican American or Latina, as well as daughter of Mexican immigrants who grew up speaking Spanish and English. However, for me, bilingualism wasn't a choice. Rather, it was something more of survival and living in the US, as well as my own enculturation to a US context. And while my research has primarily been related to bilingualism, my own lived experience as a language broker has now become quite integral in how I approach my own research. So a language broker is someone who serves as a translator or interpreter for their parents who may or may not speak the mainstream language, but might need some additional assistance. So my experiences have been central to who I am as a researcher and how I approach research, such that I approach my work in a way that moves away from centering white subjects as the norm and rather focuses on historically excluded communities, particularly those of Latinx and immigrant background. So I want to start my talk today from this excerpt from Robertson Rizzo that states, because white Americans have historically and contemporarily constituted a numerical majority and occupied most positions of power, they have been able to establish societal norms, achieve goals, give orders, control resources, and dominate and exploit others. And what this quote signifies for us here is that white supremacy is deeply rooted within our US society. And I would go as far as saying that it's also embedded in parts of our research institutions as well as our own research. And the same also reigns true for some cognitive psychology research and even in my own subfield of bilingualism. And so what we see in this graph on the right that from the recent paper by Roberts and colleagues is that in cognitive psychology journals since the 1970s, race is rarely mentioned. And in a recent study by the Jesus and colleagues, 73% of articles between 2015 and 2016 in 11 journals never mentioned race. So what we also know from cognitive research is that oftentimes there's a failure to mention important racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic background of participants. And a lot of demographic information is often underreported. And what this leads us to believe, or what this demonstrates, is that whiteness is a prevailing norm, or that whiteness is the norm, and that there's an idealized hegemonic white subject. And while we the purpose of this symposium today is to think about moving beyond cognitive universals. We should also interrogate what it means when we don't mention race and what that means for us in our own complicity in upholding white supremacy and also colorblind ideologies. Now, I want to shift gears just briefly and talk about one of my own fields is how we talk about language. So we know that most of the world is bilingual and that at least 2 in 3 children grow up in multilingual contexts, according to a recent report from UNESCO. However, within cognition and even bilingualism work, within cognition, even bilingualism work is underreported. And even in psychonomics, bilingualism tends to only have a couple of sessions. So we see that bilingualism, while being the prevailing norm, it tends to be marginalized even within our own society. And when we look at the intersections of race and language, particularly those of bilingual individuals from historically excluded communities, their bilingualism is not often viewed as something that's beneficial. Rather, it's something that needs to be corrected. Now, with what we know about race and cognition, as well as language or bilingualism, where does this leave us as a research community? Well, this leaves us with what is known as a white monolingual hegemony, which has been addressed in a lot of applied linguistics work, such as Nelson Flores' work, but we also see that this is quite prevalent in work on cognition. And we see that whiteness and monolingualism are the prevailing norms, from the insistence of monolingual comparison groups or this use of white monolingual groups as a standard. Therefore, a hindrance in our field has been this tendency to homogenize study populations and omit various lived experiences, as well as systemic and individual factors related to language and the lived experiences of our participants within systemic structures of our society. So when participants are labeled and categorized in ways that erase individual differences, we commit a disservice to our field, where we may be missing out on important factors that may lead to divergent outcomes. So the goal of my talk is to consider how, as cognitive psychologists, we can move forward to a more nuanced understanding of human cognition as it exists among different groups, and how their experiences are affected by micro and macro systems. So we can do a way that we can move away from white monolingual hegemony in cognition is by really starting to reject white monolingual hegemony. And we can do this by embracing the linguistic and cognitive diversity of our study populations, and also engaging with more bilingualism work and moving away from white-centered methods and theories, which I think is some of the work that Tissyana Camacho will also talk about in the symposium. But also we can also begin to examine variation in context of our study participants in important and fruitful ways. Further, researchers really need to begin to incorporate interdisciplinary methods and theories to better understand human cognition and in its diversity, which is what I turn to next. While we might believe that cognition is universal, we must also understand that cognition occurs in a context. And why shouldn't we think about how context affects cognition? So as researchers, we really can begin to incorporate more diverse and interdisciplinary theoretical frameworks, such as an ecological transactional resiliency perspective that acknowledges the ways in which an individual's environment can affect development and functioning, but it may also lead to effects on cognition. Further, we should also engage with an intersectional analytical approach that we can use to study the meaning and consequences of multiple categories of social group membership to understand racism, sexism, Islamophobia, and how this may also have effects on cognition. Finally, I'll briefly talk about ratiolinguistics and how we can really examine and contest these ideologies that lead to this co-naturalization of race and language. Okay. While cognition is thought to be universal, it is also important to consider the context and systems in which individuals live in and how those systems affect their cognitive and linguistic functioning. So using an ecological transactional resiliency perspective, we can begin to look at the intersecting layers embedded within an environment. And we can see how the individual level within micro and macro systems may have effect on cognition. So we know that the individual and micro levels are considered to have proximal or direct influence on the development of an individual. The ontological level includes identity-oriented factors such as gender and ethnicity, which may also have some enduring effects. And within the microsystem, we also see that this encompasses the environment which the individual immediately is engaged in, such as family and peers, which we know from some work on language brokering that this already has an effect on cognitive and linguistic outcomes. And other systems within the individual's environment are thought to have, distal or indirect influence on their development and functioning. The mesosystem includes interactions that occur between other people in an individual's microsystem, such as a parent or peer. And so what we know is that while these systems may be quite separate, they are inextricably linked, and the interaction or transactions that occur at each of these different systems may help explain much of the complexity in an individual's lived experiences, but this may also reveal something about an individual's cognition or how cognition is affected by our own context. Now, however, while we think about these systems, we really need to also take an intersectional approach in how we think about context and environment of our study populations, particularly in asking questions related to race, class, and gender and immigration, where it's not that these considerations are separate, rather they intersect and they may inform one another. For instance, in a lot of my work, I'm able to look at intersections of language ability as well as immigration, but also gender, because most of my language brokering participants tend to be female from immigrant backgrounds as well as from Latinx backgrounds. So next, when we think about ratiolinguistics, we really need to think about the 5 crucial components that make up ratiolinguistics, which include the co-naturalization of race and language, and these sort of perceptions of race and language differences, but also how racial and linguistic categories are regulated, and how the intersections of racial and language groups, and how we can dispute race and linguistic power formations in the US. And by really taking into consideration how race and language may be co-naturalized in a lot of our participant studies, from what the expectations of what someone looks like and how they're supposed to speak, we might be able to address questions such as how do perceptions of racial and language difference play a part in how bilingual outcomes are often framed within monolingual structures and epistemologies, and how the co-naturalization of race and language, as well as perceived differences of race or language, are evident in work that homogenizes bilingual experiences, as well as, in a sense, monolingual experiences, without really thinking about contextualize and the contextual experiences as well as lived experiences of our participants. So as researchers, we must acknowledge how we approach this research and how we examine our research participants, but also how we evaluate the cognitive abilities within our participants, particularly those from historically excluded communities. Now, it is evident from studies related to bilingualism that the interactional context from the micro, meso, and macro systems have significant effects on cognitive as well as social processes, such as language use, or being able to predict second language ability based on how people interact with friends in their social group or even in their neighborhood, and how even speaking more than one language can affect personality. We also see that instances from micro and meso systems also have effects on cognitive development as well as friendship choices. And we also know from recent brilliant work by Ethan Kutlu that even racial and language perceptions affect how individuals perceive speech from a speaker. So what we can see from some of this work is that it's evident that cognitive processes may be malleable depending on context. And if we consider racialized experiences of some individuals and these of participants, particularly those from historically excluded communities, as researchers, we really need to interrogate what it means when we ignore and omit contextual factors of our study populations. So here at this point, I've talked a little bit about some theoretical work that we can begin to engage in that might help us theorize a bit better how we examine these bilingual or cognitive experiences. But now I'll turn over to some methodologies. So we also really need to interrogate our methodologies. So changes are needed in how we theorize experiences within cognition in order to become a more diverse, inclusive study science that reflects our population's complex and multidimensional realities. However, current theories and methodologies do not allow us to capture and consider important variances, particularly when we implicitly and explicitly centralize and normalize monolingualism and whiteness. That is not to say that current theories and methods should be abandoned entirely. Instead, researchers must consider how some methods, especially those relying on a single experiment, can still fail to provide equitable representation regarding race, class, and varied life experiences. So one way that we can disentangle some of this is by using a mixed methods approach to look at how contextual and systemic factors may affect cognition. For example, related to bilingual experiences, we might be interested in how bilingual experiences are shaped by family relationships as well as family language policies, and how these policies might affect cognitive and linguistic processing. And answers by using mixed methods approaches, answers might reveal that participants' family experiences with racism prevented them from passing down their heritage language. And so in a recent paper by Arredondo and colleagues, she used mixed methods to examine the intricate relationship between Spanish abilities, attitudes, and ethnic identity development in Latinx children, revealing that Spanish language proficiency was related to positive affect towards children's ethnic identity. And in one of our recent papers, we used grounded theory to interpret some of our qualitative data, and we're able to extract a theme we weren't necessarily expecting, which was empathy, and revealed that language brokering experience was highly related to empathetic behaviors. So by incorporating more qualitative research methods and mixed methods approaches, we can use some of this qualitative data and maybe even design more ecologically valid studies that better reflect the experiences of our participants. And while I'm not suggesting that we should abandon quantitative methods, I think there's other quantitative methods that we might also begin to engage with that might prove to be quite fruitful. So recent work by Gullifer and Titone proposed an entropy measure to estimate the social diversity of language use. And this measure accounts for how bilinguals utilize and interact their languages and creates a measure to consider these experiences. And while they don't necessarily use a historical context of language acquisition, entropy measures are nonetheless beneficial and important when used in conjunction with other language measures, as they provide more detail about language experiences, which can also reveal something about the nature of cognition. And finally, briefly, latent profile analysis can also help researchers capture more nuanced experiences and effects on cognition. And we know in latent profile analysis, factors are examined simultaneously to determine the various combinations of profiles emerging from the data, and then individuals are fit for those profiles. Then profiles are used to predict outcomes. And in some really recent work by Kim and colleagues, she used latent profile analyses to identify adolescent profiles by integrating both brokering experiences as well as contextual factors, and identify both protective and risk profiles in adolescent language brokers. So what this reveals is that there's a lot of factors that go into various experiences, and by using latent profile analysis, maybe we can provide a more approximate quantitative modeling of lived experiences, and then use those factors or the profiles to examine effects on cognition. And to wrap up, insularity, I really want us to engage with how we've upheld white supremacy, but also how we've been complicit in white supremacy, particularly when we don't necessarily venture out of our research areas, such that insularity protects a discipline from the outside, enabling communities of scholars to distance themselves, and in more extreme forms, to absolve themselves of responsibility for what occurs in other branches of their discipline in the academy and in the world. So in order to reject white monolingual hegemony, we really need to question again, our views and our approaches, but we also really need to embrace interdisciplinary theories as well as methods, which would lead us to enhance both psychological theory and inquiry. And when we do this, I think long-term we'll be able to enhance the diversity and inclusion of historically excluded communities within cognitive psychology. And here's a list of just some readings, but finally, I want to thank my two co-authors because this talk is definitely based on one of our recent papers, Dr. Alicia Luque and Dr. Brandy Pina Watson, as well as my Llama Lab research assistants who have had to listen to this talk time and time again, and my funders. And thank you y gracias.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tissyana Camacho, and I'm an assistant professor of child and adolescent development at California State University, Northridge. My talk is titled, Creating an Inclusive Science, Considerations for Increasing the Representation of Minoritized Populations in Cognitive Psychology. Today, I will be highlighting what seems to be shortcomings in the area of cognitive psychology with regard to inclusion of minoritized populations. I'll talk about these shortcomings at different levels of the science and provide considerations for addressing these issues. I want to note my use of the term minoritized. When I am discussing minoritized populations, I am referring to ethnic racial minority populations. However, the term minoritized is more reflective of the racial social stratification and power dynamics in the US. It's not simply that these groups are historically a numerical minority, they are also recipients of treatment that exacerbate inequities in science and society at large. When I was invited to give this talk, I looked at the Psychonomic Society to find out more about the organization and conference. The first sentence of the website states, who we are. The international community of cognitive psychologists recognizes the Psychonomic Society as the preeminent society for the experimental study of cognition. This and the information that followed was helpful in understanding who I would be talking to today. With that being said, I also want to provide similar information about myself. So who I am. I am a developmental psychologist by training who focuses on social development. For those of you who aren't developmental psychologists, developmental psychology is typically split into cognitive development and social development. I am not an experimentalist. I primarily use surveys, but also use qualitative methods like semi-structured interviews. I also want to say that my training is quite interdisciplinary. A lot of my thinking and training is in higher education, community psychology, and social work, and these perspectives definitely inform me as a researcher. Last but not least, I primarily teach research methods. So I think a lot about how the social sciences use the scientific method. I think a lot about how we teach students what is and is not social science. And I think a lot about how this ultimately informs who does and does not go into the science. When I think about my own socialization as an undergraduate psychology major, it was definitely heavy on experimental work and cause and effect. Moin Syed gave a great talk at this year's Society for Personality and Social Psychology conference, where he discusses how psychology's desire to be a natural science led to an emphasis on experimentation and cause and effect. He goes on to state that this emphasis really hinders the ability to ask research questions centered on race, ethnicity, and culture. This made me think about epistemic exclusion. Isis Settles and colleagues broadly define epistemic exclusion as the combined impact of formal institutional systems and individual biases in determining what knowledge is valuable and who is deemed a credible contributor to knowledge production. So what knowledge we value, whose knowledge we value, and which ways of knowing we actually value. When we signal the importance of certain methods, we often explicitly or implicitly are signaling that we do not value other ways of knowing. So where does cognitive development and cognitive psychology fit in with these issues? Well, when a flagship journal in developmental science published a special topic issue that centered race, ethnicity, and culture, not a single paper on cognition was included. Like I said earlier, developmental psychology is typically split into cognitive development and social development. So it was pretty eye-opening to see this happen at a top journal in the field. This year, Stephen Roberts and colleagues reviewed top journals in the areas of social psychology, developmental psychology, and cognitive psychology. They reviewed how often research highlighting race is published, as well as the researchers who wrote the manuscripts and the editors who oversaw the publications. Cognitive psychology lags behind developmental and social psychology. I also want to say the numbers for each area are abysmal, and all three can and must do a better job, but cognitive psychology was quite startling. Altogether, these things suggest that there are issues in a few areas. The first is who does the science. The second is who participates in the science. The third, which is one I think about a lot, is how we teach the science. A pressing question for the field of cognitive psychology, as well as many other fields, is how can its scientists promote inclusion of racial, ethnic diversity at all levels of the science? I think it's important to consider this at different levels. We need to think about inclusivity with regard to who does the science at the researcher level. We need to think about who participates in the science, so our research samples. We also need to think about how we teach the science, so at the educator level as well. So who does the science? Let's talk about considerations for researchers. The first and foremost thing to consider is that individuals have to acknowledge and internalize that the status quo is not sustainable, nor in the best interest of the science. What I mean by that is, if we do not accept that things have to change, we're bound to continue with the same culture and ideas. I recognize that this isn't a concrete recommendation, but I do think there's deep reflection that needs to be done by individuals to examine their own actions and decisions within their scholarship. I think showing up to a talk like this demonstrates an interest in creating an equitable science, but it goes beyond just acknowledging that things have to change. There has to be a commitment to do the actual work as well. I think it's important to not remain stagnant as scholars. I'm a developmentalist, so I have to say that our growth in this area has to be continuous. And I think we just have to accept that this is the case, that we can always do better. And by trying to do better, we're getting to the place where we want to be. Lastly, it's important to reframe our understanding of how we know things. What I mean by this is we need to be open-minded to different types of techniques. As I tell my students, we should be driven by our research questions more than our methods. But if we, as a group, culturally devalue different techniques, then we contribute to epistemic exclusion. We're signaling that certain techniques are less than, and by doing that, we are limiting the kinds of questions that we can ask. I know you're probably saying, wow, those are kind of lofty and not very concrete recommendations. And yeah, I think a lot of this work actually has to begin with epistemology. However, I will point you to this article written in collaboration with Stephanie Rowley. We provide information on how to build collaborative partnerships, how to locate and retain participants, and overcoming community mistrust. We also provide an appendix of manuscripts that provide more insight into these issues and their respective solutions. So for these concrete recommendations, I do suggest reviewing this commentary. Who participates in the science is also something that researchers have to consider. In this section, I'll discuss things to consider for inclusive designs. One of the first things that I think about with inclusive designs is that we have to recognize that participants are experts of their lived experiences. The top-down approach, where the scientist is saying, this is what I think is happening and this is how I'll test it, needs to be reimagined. Other fields, such as community psychology, have a long history of doing such work, and I think it's important for us to reimagine research, even experimental research, as guided by participant input. One of the big things for me is that social scientists have to be social. It is a core belief of mine that these relationships need to be mutually beneficial. I know it's easy to say, well, we pay them, but that's simply not enough. You have to join the communities to build trust and rapport. Lastly, hire community members. One of the key things I've learned and others have shared is the importance of hiring community-based staff. We experienced a massive increase in participant recruitment when we hired someone to talk to folks and demystify our research and institution. I've been affiliated with Michigan and Hopkins, both of which have poor reputations in Detroit and Baltimore, respectively. It's actually when I got to Michigan that I heard of helicopter researchers, where we just drop in, take what we need, and leave. We have to repair those relationships. This is one of my favorite papers. It's a book chapter, so it feels hidden away from most folks, but I am happy to share it with anyone who can't access it. Here, we were aiming to go beyond the method section and interview scientists who successfully work with minoritized populations. And I very intentionally say work with. This research is about working with participants, not studying participants. Our interviewees discussed the roles of relationships, being responsive to communities, researcher identity and insider-outsider status, as well as community-engaged approaches. We provide many vignettes from these researchers, and it's a great paper to help people understand how we actually do this research. I will share 3 brief vignettes, but the chapter has many. First, Donna Witherspoon states, I was coming into a community that had great distrust for the university and its researchers. Some assumed because I was a person of color that I would have an easier time gaining entry due to some assumed shared social space. However, although I'm an African-American woman, there was still distance between me and the community because I was different and an outsider. That is, university affiliated, researcher, not from the area, etc. In retrospect, I think it took me almost 1 year to gain entry into the community, that is, establishing community partnerships. Here is an example of being responsive by Gabby Levis-Stein. Undergraduate and graduate students on the research team have volunteered to assist with the adult evening ESL classes each week. Once a week, undergraduates begin tutoring in ADVID classes, a program intended to help underserved students prepare for college. The school invited 4 of the Latino college students on the research team to be on a panel discussing what they did in high school to prepare for college in front of all the Latino 7th and 8th grade students at the middle schools. The research team has led a number of workshops for Latino parents, teachers, and staff in the school district. At each of these workshops, food and childcare are provided. 2 of the workshops have been on working with students with mental health issues. One of these workshops was for all teachers and staff, and the other was specifically for ESL teachers. 2 workshops have been in Spanish for Latino parents to discuss the process of applying for college and how to help your student prepare for college. And here's one last example of community engagement from Adriana Amani-Taylor and Myra Bamaka-Colbert that we cite in the chapter. In addition to providing us with much needed information regarding the characteristics of populations served in specific communities, community organizations provided useful information about community events that were targeted towards specific populations. For example, while visiting the Guatemalan consulate, we learned of 2 Guatemalan picnics and an evening Guatemalan culture event where we subsequently recruited participants. We learned of the same types of events for Colombians at the Colombian consulate. Lastly for today, there's how we teach the science. I will restate that acknowledging and internalizing that the status quo is not sustainable nor in the best interest of the science. How we teach our students about cognitive psychology is also a signal of who matters in the field and what matters in the field. Failing to capture the intention and natural curiosities of minoritized students in classrooms directly relates to who pursues research careers and what questions are asked. Think about your own experience. Was it because you could see yourself in the science that you decided to pursue it? We can increase student interest and engagement with cognitive psychology if we work to teach in ways that are culturally affirming and responsive. Our classrooms are spaces where we can invite students into our science. So I ask you, how inviting is your classroom? How inviting is the content that you share? How inviting are the policies that you hold in your classrooms? For me, these things directly relate to who decides to become a cognitive psychologist. For this topic, I point you to an essay I wrote with Margaret Eckelbarger in Infant and Child Development. The essay is titled Decentering Whiteness, Rethinking the Instruction of Undergraduate Research Methods Within Developmental Science. And although this paper focuses on research methods courses specifically, I do think there is a lot that can be translated to other courses, such as cognitive psychology. This paper discusses pedagogy that is equitable, inclusive, culturally affirming and relevant, anti-racist, and epistemically inclusive. Here is a photo of a table where we discuss each concept and several ways to practice each concept in a classroom. Before I leave you with all of this to digest, I want to say a few things. First, we generally are seeking universal truths about human behavior in our science. This is not possible when large segments of society and the world are ignored. We have to become more inclusive. Also, ignoring the lived experiences of minoritized populations, whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally, is a disservice to human cognition and society at large. The good news, there are solutions. There are solutions to the many issues that exist at various levels, and it's up to us to implement these changes to shift the culture in science. Thank you for listening to my talk. Please contact me if you have any questions. Take care.
In this study, we examined racial ethnic group moderations of associations between habitual sleep quality and neural activity related to episodic memory performance in an adult lifespan sample. We included adults across the lifespan because of well-known declines in sleep quality with normal aging. As people age, they report more difficulties, sleep difficulties, including reduced total sleep time and more minutes spent awake after falling asleep. Data from population-based studies show that racial ethnic minorities sleep worse than do non-Hispanic white adults across age. In this study here at the top of self-reported sleep, racial ethnic minorities were more likely to report having very short sleep, less than 5 hours a night, compared to non-Hispanic whites. Similarly, objective measures of sleep, in this case, actigraphy, which is a method we'll use in the studies I'll present here, this method tracks movements during sleep and wake. What they found in this study was that Black and Hispanic adults compared to non-Hispanic whites showed poor sleep efficiency, basically the time in bed spent asleep. You could think of it as restless sleep. Importantly, these effects cannot be explained by age, and variables often associated with minority status, including BMI, general health, educational attainment, and income. Importantly, poor sleep in cognitively normal adults is predictive of later Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. In this large longitudinal study of about 700 people, normal older adults were divided into good and poor sleepers according to sleep fragmentation, which is measured as brief arousals or movements during otherwise quiet sleep periods. Highly fragmented sleepers were more likely to convert to AD and at a faster rate than were minimally fragmented sleepers. Multiple studies have shown that there are racial ethnic disparities in AD prevalence. Of course, we know that AD is predicted to increase in the US population drastically over the next 40 years, but this study used Medicare beneficiary data from 2014 to predict AD prevalence in African Americans, non-Hispanic whites, and Hispanics over the age of 65 for 2060, estimated for 2060. So to what extent the poor sleep in racial ethnic minorities contributes to this increased risk of AD is unknown. We know from a wealth of studies in young, healthy people that sleep plays a necessary role in episodic memory, which is memory for personally experienced events. My former student, Emily Hawkett, published a meta-analysis this year in which we found that young and older adults' memory was similarly related to habitual sleep quality. There weren't enough studies in this meta-analysis that reported racial ethnic demographics, and we assumed they had samples that were largely non-Hispanic whites, like many studies. So how racial ethnic disparities impact sleep outcomes is unknown. Emily Hawkett, my former student, and I have been investigating how age-related impairments in sleep impact those in memory. In the study I'll present today, we have been interested in two questions. To what extent does poor sleep quality contribute to age-related declines in episodic memory performance and supporting neural activity? And what is the extent of poor sleep, or what is the impact of poor sleep rather, in Black African Americans on episodic memory functioning? To measure sleep, we use this method, actigraphy, to index sleep-wake cycles and provide minute-by-minute data over multiple nights. So with actigraphy, you can index whether a person sleeps solidly, wakes for multiple minutes or for several seconds, multiple times, how long it takes to fall asleep, and how long they sleep. We collected data for multiple nights because although most studies report average sleep metrics over a couple of nights or so, there is some data showing that night-to-night variability in sleep is a contributor to poor cognition. We want to look at that. Subjects performed a paired associate memory task in which they studied these word pairs by deciding whether or not they were related, candle and phone are these related words. During the memory test, some of these pairs were presented intact and some were rearranged, and subjects had to decide which were intact. I'll return to the intact and rearranged pairs and their significance in a few slides. This study included 20 young adults, 11 of whom were Black African American, and 30 older adults, 9 of whom were Black African American. We recorded EEG during both encoding and retrieval. So on the left is memory performance measured using D prime for high confidence judgments collapsed across the intact and rearranged pairs. We used high confidence trials only as we wanted to reduce the influence of guessing on this memory performance measure. Actigraphy gives many output variables, some of which are correlated, and so we used principal component analysis to reduce the data for the subsequent analyses I'll present. Here I'm showing just one of the output variables, which is the coefficient of variation in sleep fragmentation. So sleep fragmentation is a measure of the night-to-night variability in the number of awakenings during quiet episodes. You can think of it as restlessness during sleep. So on the left, you can see the episodic memory performance was reduced by age, not surprisingly, across racial ethnic groups with no difference between the racial ethnic groups. Sleep fragmentation, presented on the right, was greater for older adults, as predicted, and for Black African American adults than non-Hispanic whites, and that racial group difference was across age. Here we used, as I said, PCA, principal component analysis, to generate a sleep stability factor representing how stable a person's sleep was from night to night. First, on the left, we found that low sleep stability predicted worse memory performance in older adults, but not young adults, and this was across racial groups. We then examined oscillatory EEG activity that's sensitive to successful memory retrieval. Namely, here we used alpha desynchronization during retrieval and found that greater sleep stability, here, high sleep stability, was predictive of greater alpha desynchronization in Black African-American adults only, regardless of their age. We speculated that those Black African-American subjects with the worst sleep showed the smallest neural index of successful episodic memory retrieval, even though this relationship wasn't borne out in the behavior. This alpha desynchronization has been linked to successful episodic memory retrieval in a number of studies, but also in attentional orienting. Therefore, it may not be the most sensitive measure of episodic memory retrieval per se. This sample was also relatively small. Consequently, we wanted to follow up these results with a larger sample and a more sensitive measure of episodic memory success. In our next study, we wanted to increase the sample size, expand our age range to include middle age, and assess neural indices of episodic memory differently than before. So neurocomputational theories of memory suggest that successful episodic memory retrieval is dependent upon the reinstatement of encoding-related neural activity and the associated operations. Consistent with these theories, neuroscientists have examined the overlap in neural activity during encoding of events with that from retrieval of those same events. These overlapping neural activity patterns are referred to as encoding retrieval similarity and are predictive of memory performance and reduced by age in the literature. In the study I'll present now, we wanted to follow up our prior study to measure the impact of racial ethnic sleep disparities on encoding retrieval similarity, or ERS, across the adult lifespan, including middle age. In this study, we included 39 non-Hispanic whites and 34 racial ethnic minorities. We sampled the adult lifespan, including middle age, and all subjects performed the same study procedures as in the last study I presented. I want to remind you that some of the pairs that people saw during the retrieval were intact, such as in this slide here, candle and phone. Even though they're rearranged on the screen in the way that they're presented, they are an intact pair, and people should say intact if they remember that pair. Others were rearranged. So those words were all studied, but not previously together. And again, EEG was recorded during both encoding and retrieval. So on the left, well, first we collapsed across minority groups to increase power. Importantly, though, the same patterns were observed between the subgroups. As before, both on the left, as you can see, average sleep duration here, and night-to-night sleep stability here were reduced in racial ethnic minorities. On the right, these simple slopes illustrate the negative relationship between low sleep stability and memory performance, with the strongest effects in older participants, shown in the maroon color, across racial ethnic groups. We can also see in this figure, in these slopes, that poor sleep exacerbates the negative effect of age on episodic memory performance. So this is really paralleling the behavioral results we saw in the last study, except here in an adult lifespan sample. So poor sleep seems to be particularly predictive of poor memory performance in older participants. Turning to the ERS analysis of the EEG data, we examined the similarity between spectral EEG, that is oscillatory EEG, for each word pair at retrieval and its corresponding trial during encoding. Using this method, we could identify the specific time windows showing significant correlations in oscillatory power between encoding and retrieval for a correctly recognized intact or correctly rejected rearranged word pair. And importantly, this ERS was above the level of just general correlations between encoding and retrieval, which of course there's a lot of overlap, but this is trial specific or word pair specific. So for example, here, we would compare these oscillatory patterns for the candle phone pair during retrieval and for that same pair during encoding. We found that lower sleep stability was predictive of higher ERS for intact pairs. That's this slope here. And this was only observed significantly in racial ethnic minorities. ERS was also related to, for rearranged pairs, was also related to sleep stability, but in a negative way. So people who had lower sleep stability had lower ERS for rearranged pairs. And this was across racial ethnic groups. Okay, so because intact pairs can be recognized on the basis of familiarity without recollection of any specific episodic details, while correct rejection of rearranged pairs is thought to require the recollection of previously presented pairs in order to reject the recombined ones, also known as recall to reject, we speculate that those participants, particularly minority participants with more variable sleep quality, may have relied on familiarity-based recognition to a greater extent than recollection to support their memory performance. So we don't think there is necessarily anything inherent about race, ethnicity driving these effects, but more likely race-related psychosocial factors like race-related stress, for example. And we do have some evidence of this in this particular study. So a subset of the subjects completed the index of race-related stress, where they were asked to endorse on a Likert scale statements related to racism. So people who endorse statements like, you have been subjected to racist jokes by whites, non-Blacks in positions of authority, and you did not protest for fear that they might have held it against you. That would be an example of one such statement. Another would be, you notice that when Black people are killed by the police, the media informs the public of the victim's criminal record or negative information in their background, suggesting they got what they deserved. So these are statements from a measure called the Index of Race-Related Stress that's been used many times in the literature. People who are from different racial ethnic groups can complete this questionnaire either as related to themselves or a close other. But generally, Black African-American participants have the highest values on this IRS measure. So people who had lower sleep duration, lower sleep time, and also greater sleep variance had higher race-related stress. So we think that this suggests a component of this psychosocial factor related to race, namely race-related stress, is contributing potentially to these racial ethnic patterns that we're seeing in sleep, disparities as well as related memory outcomes. So just to conclude here, we found that sleep quality was reduced with age and in racial ethnic minorities across age, and that race-related stress may contribute to these racial ethnic sleep disparities. In 2 studies, we show that consistent high-quality sleep may be especially important for episodic memory performance as one ages, regardless of race ethnicity. I'll just mention something here that sometimes I'm asked about, which is if you sleep consistently, but you have bad sleep every night, or you just sleep for 2 hours a night, but it's consistent, do you see these same patterns? And the answer is no, it has to be good quality sleep and consistent good quality sleep that's related to better memory outcomes. We did look at that. Finally, by assessing the influence of sleep on neural activity supporting episodic memory, we show that reduced sleep quality in racial ethnic minorities may alter the mechanisms engaged to support memory performance, with a potential greater reliance on familiarity than recall to reject based recollection. Finally, just want to thank you for your attention and my lab, particularly Emily Hawkett, who conducted these studies.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for including me in this important session. I want to thank the research team and participants who support the work that I'll discuss and the grants that fund this work. The main points of my talk are essentially that we have already identified fundamental causes of gaps in knowledge about brain behavior relationships in non-white, Western industrialized, well-educated and English-speaking people. And we have the tools that we need to create a more inclusive and relevant cognitive aging research. Cognitive aging research can and should become centered in public health and social justice principles. And what I'll do today is review a few key factors that emerge when cognitive aging research is community-centered. So brain health, to me, includes both the identification of risk and resilience factors prior to the onset of cognitive impairment and the causes of disparities in cognitive impairment, diagnosis or recognition of cognitive impairment in older adults, and also measurement of the severity and course of cognitive function, and also access to experiences with and care delivery for people with cognitive impairment. And brain health equity requires removing obstacles to brain health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences. These are powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality of education, and housing. And so to equalize opportunities, those with worse health and fewer resources need more efforts expended to improve their health environments and health care. That means that we need to examine who and what forces and power and money are driving the questions we ask, are driving the populations that we recruit, the evidence that we get, and how we interpret that evidence. Now I'm going to show some research about these fundamental causes and how they influence cognitive aging and dementia outcomes from studies that are forming equal partnerships with research participants from minoritized backgrounds and have produced rigorous study designs that shed light on life course mechanisms of disparities in cognitive aging. And the first study is the YCAP study. Since 1992, we've been partnering with residents of Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, and Inwood to recruit and follow about 6,500 older adults who were randomly recruited from Medicare recipients residing in census tracts surrounding Columbia Medical Center. They've participated in longitudinal memory study for many years. And this cohort has now become an intergenerational study. I'll tell you a little bit about this later, a little bit more about this later. And the purpose of both of these studies is to determine life course mechanisms of disparities in dementia. One of the key findings of this work is that African Americans or non-Hispanic Black people and Hispanic or Latino Latinx participants are at higher risk of developing dementia over the course of follow-up compared to non-Hispanic white people. This figure shows cumulative incidence by age of white, Black, and Hispanic participants in YCAP. It's work that's being updated by Weiming Watson, even after accounting for group differences in education, income, and occupational attainment, and cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease. One important lesson is that as cohorts get older, the magnitude of racial and ethnic disparities narrows. Laura Zahodny examined interactions between age and race in both YCAP and MIDAS, which is a national study of middle-aged people, and found that racial disparities in episodic memory and executive function were larger at younger age than in older age in both these cohorts. And this reflects selective survival. Black people with poor cognition are more likely to die and are not available to study at older ages, and this is called an age as leveler effect. It has implications for our analyses, looking at risk factors for cognitive decline because we must take selective survival into account. One possible mechanism of racial disparities in cognitive aging is cerebrovascular disease. This is Adam Brickman's work, and this figure shows one way that Adam has quantified burden of white matter hyperintensities using MRI images of the brain. He showed that in YCAP, white non-Hispanic older adults had less white matter hyperintensities at all ages than African American and Latinx people. He and Laura Zahadny also showed that these white matter hyperintensities were related to lower cognitive scores in this figure showing language scores in African American participants, but not among white participants in YCAP. Adam has also been quantifying hippocampal volume using MRI in the YCAP cohort and found that among the non-Hispanic white people who had lower hippocampal volume at baseline, they were more likely to go on to develop Alzheimer's disease and dementia at a subsequent visit than people with higher hippocampal volume. This was true in the non-Hispanic white people, but not in the non-Hispanic Black people. So these results suggest some differential mechanisms to dementia across race and ethnicity, and we sought to look at this further in a younger cohort. I mentioned earlier that the YCAP study has become intergenerational. We've recruited adult children of YCAP participants, and as of now, we've studied about 2,000 of them and scanned about 600 of them in the MRI scanner. And this figure that I'm showing you now, a study by Indira Turney, a postdoc in our group, represents 500 offspring and about 1,000 of the parent generation YCAP participants. And what Indira found was that Black participants had greater white matter hyperintensity volume compared to white and Latinx participants in both the YCAP and the offspring studies. Compared to the offspring, the parent generation and older age was more strongly associated with greater white matter hyperintensities in the white participants. Age-related effects observed in later life in the white participants were already apparent in midlife for Black participants for both cortical thickness, which is not shown in this graph, and white matter hyperintensity volume. So racial disparities in small vessel and cerebrovascular disease are apparent in midlife already and suggest accelerated brain aging among Black people. Like many other studies around the world, the YCAP study found secular trends in cognitive aging and dementia, such that the rate of change of memory was slower for people who were born later. And this benefit was explained by higher childhood and family socioeconomic status and higher educational attainment. Because these secular trends in educational attainment were due to policy changes requiring additional years of school, these results support a causal link between educational attainment and cognitive function in later life. And we wanted to investigate these policy changes further and how they relate to later life cognitive function. We see policy changes as natural experiments that offer the opportunity to establish causal links. And I think in general, we should be taking more advantage of that in cognitive aging research. We used the REGARD study, a national study of racial and geographic risk factors for stroke and vascular contributions to cognitive impairment and dementia, which oversampled Black people and people living in the stroke belt states to investigate the relationship of policy changes in school investment and later life cognitive function. We first had to dig into historical records of school administrative data to get state and county data for length of school year, student-teacher ratio, and percent attendance for 1911, the years 1911 through 1960. And when we did that, we found racial and geographic differences in some of these basic data reflecting school investment and school quality. So if you were Black and living in South Carolina in the 1930s and 1940s, the actual amount of time that school was open was about half that for white students in the same state, or all students who were living in northern states. So you see in this analysis, we were able to include almost 20,000 people using the regards cohort, and found that higher investment in elementary school was associated with lower risk of cognitive impairment later in life. The effect was strongest in whites. You see that for the column in model 4, even after accounting for confounding variables. The effect was strongest in whites, especially white women. Note the benefit of school quality was much lower among Black people in general, especially among Black men. Racism in schools and the labor market, we think, served to counteract the benefits of schooling for Black Americans, particularly for Black men. In another study called Project Talent Aging Study, it uses participants who were in a study in 1960 called Project Talent. It was a survey of 377,000 people who were in high school in 1960. Every student in each school that was selected was a participant in 2 days of testing, which included personality, knowledge, and cognitive ability data and demographic questions. Now, the Project Talent Aging Study has tracked 22,000 people who were a part of Project Talent now in 2018. And this is a school-based sample because we were really interested in school characteristics as factors that might promote resilience to neuropathology. This is preliminary work by Nika Seblova, who's a postdoc in my group. She developed a composite of school quality indicators based on the reports of 1960 administrators in each school about teacher qualifications and teacher salary and class size. The lowest quality was experienced by Black people who were in Project Talent and highest in the white people. And we assessed cognitive function over the phone using wordless learning, phonemic and semantic fluency, and found that people who attended higher quality schools had better cognitive test scores, especially wordless learning and phonemic fluency. And then when you break it down by race and ethnicity, you see that the effect is largely driven by white people, but does not hold up among Black people. In other words, higher school quality was not associated with better test scores among Black participants. Another important contextual influence is neighborhood factors. Study of neighborhood and cognitive function is relatively new. In our group, Lily Kamalian is examining the Area Deprivation Index and cognitive function. And Danny Pohl and Nika Seblova recently looked at measures of residential segregation and cognition in YCAP. They found that living in segregated neighborhoods was associated with lower language scores. Conversely, living in Block groups with higher potential contact between racial and ethnic groups was associated with higher scores on cognitive tests. And non-Hispanic Black older adults were more likely to experience the negative effects of neighborhood segregation on cognition and dementia than non-Hispanic white people. All of these indices, not just the ADI, but also residential segregation, partly capture downstream effects of structural racism and unequal distributions of wealth and resources on cognition. Therefore, desegregation and equitable access to resources have the potential to improve later life cognitive health. So in summary, there's evidence that life course social factors, most of them patterned by structural racism, influence dementia risk and resilience and cognitive aging. The most informative research on mechanisms of disparities is not from convenient samples, but from population representative samples. And our current research infrastructure assumes that people are white and English speaking, well-educated, insured, have easy access to transportation, are connected, and have a study partner. We need to change this. Resources needed to initiate research in communities that have traditionally been excluded from cognitive aging research include measures of the lived experience of minoritized populations, but also population feasible biomarkers to determine their relative contribution. We need to create a cognitive aging research centered in public health and social justice. In order to do this, we need to be able to answer questions about which anti-racist policies will improve cognitive function and support organizations like Black in Neuro, who are building a more inclusive field. Thank you.
Thanks to all the panelists that we've had today. You've gotten a lot of applause in the chat. Several questions have come up. The first one is, I'll read out, is from Anne Cleary. I've been mulling over the idea of participants as experts. Do you have any thoughts on how to resolve the apparent conflict between participants as experts in research and the various cognitive psychology findings that suggest that our own subjective impressions of our cognitive processes are often wrong? An example is the often found disconnect between student impressions of their own learning versus their learning outcomes. Another might be high confidence false memory. Is there a good way to reconcile the study of things like cognitive illusions and the notion of participants as experts?
Thank you. So I think that question came up during my talk. And when I think about participants being experts, I really just think about people from that community having an input in the process, right? So I think, you know, I think a lot of people, one of the quotes I had in my presentation from Shauna Cooper spoke about her being an African-American and people just assuming she has access to these spaces because she, you know, shares that social identity. And so much of me doing work with Latino populations, it's not easier for me because I'm perceived to be an insider. In an academic space, I'm perceived to be an insider. But really, when I was doing research with families in Detroit, you know, I didn't grow up in Detroit. I am not Mexican American. I actually am an outsider to them. So it's not necessary. And I think going back to the question, I think it's really about talking to people, right? Like we come up with this method, whatever it may be, right? So I have gone into people's homes and just thinking about what does this method make sense for the people that you're working with? Does the research design make sense, right? And one of the other, Adriana Monte-Taylor, talks about we learned about events to talk to people at by being in the community, right? So when I think about participants as experts, I really think about we're, you know, even if we share social identities with these participants, we are outsiders. And I think they are able to help us in terms of making science inclusive and accessible. So I can see what the question is getting at, right? Like in terms of, you know, we don't necessarily remember things the same way, and thinking about like, you know, what students actually learn and what they perceive they learn. So yes, there is, when we look at it that way, yeah, I can see how participants as experts might not be too appealing. But when I'm thinking about participants as experts, it's really thinking about including them in the like research design, the development of tasks, you know, things like that. Like we pilot our research all the time. For the most part, many of us pilot our research, but who are we piloting it with, right? Are they really, they might really help us in terms of like,
I just feel like there are like finer things that these, participants who are experts in their lives can share with us that we don't really have when we don't include them in the design of the science.
Thank you very much. There's another very popular question that Michael Kane raises, and it's to all the speakers. I suspect that a concern that some cognitive psychologists share about introducing scientific questions about race and ethnicity into our research, especially in research focusing on cognitive abilities, is that we have seen how badly this has gone in the neighboring field of intelligence, both historically and presently. I'd be interested to hear from any of the speakers address this point of the potential concern and how to responsibly consider group differences in cognitive research. I'd be extremely hesitant to do this kind of work without collaborating with sociologists, anthropologists, et cetera. Note that this is not a concern about sampling broadly and reporting extensive demographic information about an entire sample. Richard?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Yeah, I think this is a very good question and a very real concern. Particularly, I think it's useful for people to kind of look historically how these sort of things have gone in psychology just in the 20th century. And in terms of figuring out how to avoid some of the pitfalls, I think one important thing is the understanding of what race is, kind of historically, and understanding different ways of thinking about it, which, depending on your training, if you're PhDs in psychology or something like that, you might not have learned really much about it at all. And so I think that one thing that helps is understanding about the kind of
Okay.
And kind of understanding how that. Oops, sorry, am I going out a little bit?
Yeah, we were having trouble. You were freezing a little bit.
Sorry, I'll turn off my video, see if that helps. But basically what I was trying to say is that I think researchers who want to kind of talk about race and cognition have to do a lot of legwork, kind of understanding what race is and how it's been kind of biologicalized, I guess. And it's hard to control interpretation of the work once it gets out of the lab. I think about including a lot of information about how I would interpret variations in kind of cognitive performance that may seem to correlate with race, even if I have a lot of information about the context that I believe is going on there that may kind of become racialized through people's experiences. It's hard to keep people from looking at that and immediately interpreting that as, okay, Black people are like this and other people are like that, right? And so it's going to require a lot of work on the part of the researchers in really thinking about how they are framing the results and how people may be interpreting things. And, the larger problem is kind of how people think about race in general, which in some senses is kind of a larger problem than the one that we're kind of primarily talking about here, but it is one that we're going to have to be engaging with as we do this work.
Thanks, Richard. I'll turn it over to Audrey.
Yeah, that was great, Richard. I agree. And that's a great question. So I would just say, I don't think everybody has to start doing research, examining, these racial ethnic groupings or culture as a variable, moderator, whatever. No. But I think at a start, it would be good to start reporting who we include in our research samples. So even for studies, I mean, I'm as guilty of this as anyone else, right? But only really recently have we started reporting all the demographics of our participants. I mean, everyone reports how many females, but not everyone reports information about other sort of demographics. And so we're doing that. And I think that's at least something we can do. And then now we know more, like how homogeneous are these research samples? And I think that's a good start that everyone can contribute to, even if you don't explore these variables directly.
Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in? Okay, the next question comes from Simon Fisher-Baum.
Oh, I think Belem had her hand up.
Belem, go ahead.
Yeah, really quick. I have to echo both Richard and Audrey. I think one way that as cognitive psychologists we can engage with race research is actually teaching it, but also teaching it and taking from what Tissyana's talk was talking about is really thinking about who are we teaching in our classes, what research are we assigning, and how do we engage with these sort of questions? I dropped in the chat Bonilla Silva's and Zuberi's book on white logic, white methods, where even if I don't think everyone needs to engage in race research because we don't want to get into these questions that are going to be comparing racial groups that may end up having deficient outcomes, because that's not the point of this either. But I highly encourage folks to look at this book because it even tells us how to look at statistics or think about how we use statistical analyses. But just to throw that out there, but I think in teaching and what students we're recruiting and what sort of research questions we support our graduate and undergraduate students in. Coming from a cognitive department, I remember hearing like, that's not cognitive research. So things that are so colloquial and we hear every single day, we really need to take some introspection and think about how we reproduce white supremacy and even our everyday language with our undergraduate students and graduate students and even postdocs, I would venture to say.
Excellent.
And I want to add on to that. I really focus on the educational part, so I think about it a lot. But also, I've been also just thinking about reviewing, right? So most of us probably review papers here and there. How do we respond to questions of, race, ethnicity, diversity, and inclusion? I think how the reviewing process, and I think someone brought it up in the chat very early into I think the first talk. Reviewing is a part of this too, right? They're the gatekeepers of what eventually becomes science and published. So reviewing is part of this as well.
Thank you. So another question that came up from Simon Fisher-Baum is thanks everybody for a great talk. You said earlier that researchers know the contextual factors that might be important, but I'm not so sure this is always true. What if we as individual researchers do not understand the sets of factors that make up the context? How should we go about developing a fuller understanding of the potentially relevant contextual factors of our participants?
I think this is linked to the answer to the first question, which is, talk to people. Who are the people who you're seeking to collaborate with on the research? Who are the communities that you are seeking to collaborate with? When I first started working in Washington Heights, I went into the homes of the older adults that were participating in this longitudinal study. And I listened to their life stories. I found out a lot. I had made a ton of assumptions myself. For example, that the Black people who live in Northern Manhattan were born and raised there, that they were New Yorkers, and that's absolutely not the case. They're from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. They had, educational experiences and, childhood experiences that were really varied. And I learned more about sort of what they were bringing to their, life as an older adult that shaped the rest of my career. So, I think that it does start with, actually, asking questions and treating participants as equal partners. I think that just a riff on that, participants as experts is participants as equal collaborators. That's the, I'm an expert and they're experts as well. And so, together, I think that creates a better science. And so when we talk about lived experience, that's really what we're saying. If you have a conversation with participants, if you have a relationship and rapport with participants and with the community, you start to hear what is actually meaningful. I've had, been in many presentations talking about cognitive function and aging, and people bring up stress to me. Well, what about stress? How does stress affect my memory? And now, we're seeing data from Dr. Duarte on, racial stress and sleep, and how that may down the line, affect our thinking and memory. So, that's my at least the start of an answer that I would give to that question.
Going on to the next question from John Taylor. In evolutionary psychology, universals, cognitive or otherwise, are a critical feature of findings relevant to evolved mechanisms and cannot really be ignored. As a result, non-universal findings are extremely important for falsifying assumptions of evolved behaviors and mechanisms. Since universals are still important to understanding cognition, how do you suggest including to search for universals in your proposed approach? This was directed to Richard.
All right, so here is how I think about that. I feel like there's this balance between variation and kind of uniformness that we're thinking about in terms of how people behave and kind of cognition. I don't think it is the case that kind of anything goes with human cognition in the sense that, who knows, exactly what could be going on with any person depending on their kind of cultural background. There's likely some limitations having to do with being human, but there's also a huge amount of potential variability there, right? And so what we're looking for may not be universals in the sense that we think of kind of everyone doing things in the exact same way. If we're thinking about different cognitive processes, so much as a range of possibilities, and thinking about how kind of cultural variation and other sorts of kind of contextual variation can have people all over kind of a large space of possibilities. And I think kind of the difficult thing for us is kind of figuring out what that landscape is and kind of defining, how much variation there is and kind of how much is similar across different types of people, different cultures, different kind of contextual background. So I know it's kind of a, kind of saying there are and there aren't universals at the same time. I think that's kind of the best way to explain what I think my approach is.
Thank you, Richard. Going on to another question from Michelle Ellefson. I really like the idea of—
Sensi, do you mind if I riff a little bit on Richard's answer?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wasn't sure if you saw my hand up. I like what Richard said about this universal question, but I also want to add some just like practical things that I think about, which is that I think that we should design our studies to test for these, whether these cognitive processes or the way that we measure them, or the constructs that we think we're measuring are universal. And there are, obviously they have some flaws, but there are some methodologic techniques like invariance analysis that we've done on batteries of cognitive tests for measuring memory and executive function and speed of processing and so on across different ethnic and racial and linguistic and educational and sex gender groups, looking for differential relationships between the latent constructs and between the items and the constructs that they're supposed to be measuring. So this type of invariance analysis is one way of actually testing for universality of measures of cognition. Guess what you need to do that? You need like a sample size of people who actually fit into the group that may traditionally be underrepresented in those samples and excluded from other prior research. So I think I mentioned in the talk that all of our staff are bilingual in Spanish and English, and primarily from the neighborhood. And that's how we're able to enroll, 60, 70% of our participants are Spanish speaking. And so you can't do that without preparing in your design. Our target was to represent the neighborhood, and we met that target. So you need to design your studies so that you're able to recruit enough people and include enough people to actually test whether these constructs are universal. And that means, planning that from the start, making your study capable of taking that on, and then planning those analyses intentionally. I think that's my practical answer for the question about how do we test for universals.
Thank you, Jennifer. Returning to Michelle Ellison's question. She said, I really like the idea of encouraging reporting demographic details and research, but for me in the United Kingdom, the more information we have about participants, the more data protection rules we have to follow. For example, racial identity is a protected characteristic from a data protection point of view, requiring more complicated restrictions in terms of data storage and data sharing. And she notes that she does those when they have such data. What do you think is a good way to balance potentially competing goals of data protection, open data, and collecting more demographic data in cognitive research?
I think that was asked during mine, so I'm happy to jump in. So I think with getting demographic information and getting participant information, there should be justification why you're getting that demographic information in the first place. And what does that do in relation to your research question? And for protection of data, of course, I think the basics of making sure it's anonymous and that there's no way that people will be able to find out who your participants are. So I think first protecting your participants, especially if they are from a historically excluded or marginalized community. And in terms of, let's see what else. A good way to balance competing goals. I would trust that our IRBs, at least at our institutions that ask us a lot of questions about the information that we're getting, that we are, I guess, really upfront about the information, why we're getting certain information and what we're going to do with that information. But I'll turn it over to Tissyana.
Yeah, so I appreciate the honesty there, saying like this is something that's actually hard to do, and it might be a bit harder in the UK. But I think it being harder or more challenging doesn't preclude people from doing the work, right? So a research lab I was working with at the University of Michigan actually wanted to conduct research with undocumented families. So for those who aren't familiar with the term undocumented, meaning families that don't have legal residency or citizenship to be in the United States. And that was an IRB challenge that took months. And we had to file a certificate of confidentiality, which is something that was mandated by NIH so that we can protect our participants should anything ever be subpoenaed. This is a lot of extra work, but these families deserve to have their voices represented, right? Their experiences, so we, study ethnic identity development and ethnic racial socialization, so how families talk to them, and undocumented families have to talk to their children about these issues and what that means for their psychological health. And so I would just say it's going to be difficult. None of the work I do is easy, right? Like being in churches, giving, talks on like how to prep for college, right? I ended up doing college tours for students, middle school in Detroit. I did a college tour at the University of Michigan. And so I took a tour myself with like the official undergrad people so that I could do it my own way for these students. So yes, it's difficult, but necessary work to have these voices included in the science. No one who does this work does it because it's easy. We do it because it's important.
Thank you. There's a kind of follow-up question from Veronica Yan. I've come across problems when collecting data in Canadian schools. We aren't allowed to ask for demographics, and it turns out that the schools themselves don't even collect the data either. Do you have any suggestions for how to tackle that kind of problem?
I don't want to trivialize this at all, and I'm not in Canada, so I don't know what the rules are, but this is an example, I think, of where scientists need to step into advocacy. We cannot have solutions to these major challenges in our science if we do not have the proper data. And so I think all the information about COVID as an example of how it has hit minoritized populations harder, how it has hit some neighborhoods harder than others. That would not be possible without the data being collected, the proper data being collected. And what I would suggest is that there may be research studies in other domains, maybe not with school children, but with adults that do collect information like this. I am familiar with the Canadian Health and Aging Study, and it's my understanding that those types of data are collected. And so maybe there are some strategies and techniques that those researchers use to overcome, or that can be used to help to advocate for that type of data collection in schools.
Thank you, Jennifer. Another question. Everybody, first Chris Bilianto. Everybody had great talks. My question can be answered by anyone, I guess. What strategy can cognitive scientists do to encourage cognitive research outside of the US and Europe? In Asia, I think many publications about cognitive studies come from East Asia, but not so many cognitive researchers come from other parts of Asia. Parentheses, I'm from Indonesia, by the way. I think if researchers from other different continents can work together, we can really answer whether a cognitive mechanism is universal or not.
I'll just take that. Yeah, I think this is such a good question. And if I can cite one positive thing about this pandemic, and it is hard, that one of them is that we've been forced to have meetings this way. And, I've been to many of these at this point, and they're more inclusive than they used to be. So you've got people who are coming, I'm guessing, well, I'm not guessing, I know this to be true, that there are people now coming to these meetings from all over the world that previously wouldn't be able to come, or very, very difficult to come. And I think that's a good thing that's happened. And I think that's part of the reason why people are really seriously thinking about how are these conferences going to go here on out. Are we going to have hybrid meetings? Are we going to have them recorded and available to anybody who wants to see them? I mean, these are things we can discuss, but I think that could be a good start to fostering some connections across continents.
Thank you, Audrey. Another question directed to Belem. In Bronfenbrenner's model, there is another system, albeit much less studied, that is relevant to bilingualism, the chronosystem. While race doesn't change over time, language does. How would you suggest this system be integrated into cognitive research relating to bilingualism?
That's an excellent question, Gigi. And I think Deborah Titone and Marigold Tiv actually have a preprint available where they talk about Bronfenbrenner's model and thinking about time. So we know that language isn't constant, and our language abilities even change over time. And one easy way I think we can include this in our cognitive research is actually conducting more longitudinal studies. Here at UT, I work with Dr. Soo-Young Kim, and she has a wonderful longitudinal study that she's been working with language brokers for, I would say, 10 years. And I'm very happy that she included me once I came to UT, and she's been able to track their changes on language proficiency and also their language brokering experiences over time. And more recently, we started looking at some cognitive measures. So I think longitudinal studies are awesome. They're a lot of work. I've never done one on my own, but in collaboration with Soo-Young, I've been able to do it. So I think that's one way to look at it. But also think about language as not something that's static. Our language experiences, even our interactions with language, do change even from moving across, within a state or across states. So I think thinking about longitudinal studies is a good way to think about it. Yeah.
I want to remind or tell the panelists if you have any questions for each other, also you can raise a hand. Right now, I'll go to a question for Jennifer from Ira Hyman. Wonderful presentation. I like the work focused on disparities in aging. For those of us working with college students as participants, are there measures we should routinely use as a part of our cognitive studies? I am wondering about questions concerning background, opportunities, family stress, community stress, and so on.
This is actually a question that I had to the other presenters. Is there a sort of set of questions that that cognitive psychologists see as reflecting the lived experience of people who represent the full spectrum of experience, experiences and backgrounds? There is something in at NIH called the Phoenix toolkit that provides questions about experiences of racism and discrimination, about sexual orientation, about about gender identification, and experiences of stress, and also a residential history. I think the residential history is incredibly important. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in my work of older people, but so I think I think that college students have a whole 16, 17, 18 years that they've lived. I'd love to know where they were born. I'd love to know about their parents' education. I'd love to know where they went to school. I would ask them every place they went to school. I'd ask them the racial and ethnic breakdown of the schools that they went to. I would get a residential history. In other words, up to if they can remember their addresses. I would love that information. And then psychosocial wise, I think that as we're measuring cognitive function, they are in a context. We need to learn about their social support, about their social network, about their both positive and negative psychosocial experiences. So I think a service, maybe Spark can do this, is to think about, what is what are the domains, what are the constructs? People have thought a lot about social determinants of health, and they've defined these domains. We have models of life course experiences across many different levels of analysis. And those packages can probably be put together, not slapped indiscriminately on a study. You really have to kind of think about it. But I think that there might be some starting points, and I think we can learn from each other on that.
I think one thing I think about is also subjective social class. So I've spoken with students who, their household had maybe 6 people, and the household family income was, I think $34,000 total. And they said, but I'm not poor. Like I have a house, like I have a roof over my head. And so I think when we just ask them to report, their family income, we're missing a lot of information. And so asking them to talk about, how they feel in terms of their social class, again, if it's relevant to your question, you'll find some really interesting information. Again, just talking to people. We so easily, I think, would say like, oh, wow, that you are definitely below poverty. But they didn't feel that way at all. And I think that is something I remember often, is that what we see quantitatively does not always reflect, what they're feeling qualitatively, or yeah.
Thank you, guys. A final question from Susan Earp. Developing community partnerships is so important for increasing trust, recruitment, and engagement. Any advice for how to do this in a pandemic?
I can jump in for a second because I've actually been trying to do that right now for one of my projects. I had a project funded right before the pandemic started, and we had all these plans involved going to churches and things like that. And now all of that is shut down. And so we've kind of had to scramble to figure out how to reach the community and be very creative about it. So we're on places like Facebook groups where we find little pockets of the community. We're looking for people kind of local to where I am in kind of Prince George's County. So kind of figuring out your location, wherever it is you are, finding people in these communities and talking to other people who made these kind of links about what the kind of formal and informal groups that there are that you can interact with is one way to go about it. We found a lot of parent groups here. So I do work with young children a lot. And so we find these kind of parent groups that are local. And that can be hit or miss. And it is, long work. It's not that every group is going to be super interested in chatting with you. And the ones that are, you may have to, take some time to develop those relationships. Another thing, one last thing is, the kind of level of openness where you are may vary. So we've been trying to figure out when the weather is nice, people really want to get out somewhere, where do they go? And, it's a lot of farmers markets and things like that for us. And we actually find that works relatively well, just to kind of find some people where they're at and develop some contact.
Thank you, Richard. We've come to the end of our time. I want to thank the organizers and the panelists again for a great session. And have a good rest of the Psychonomics.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.